opportune times in our lives, and really our response is to continue to speak to us, for here I am. Just want to share with you a few thoughts from Psalm 63 as we continue. Psalm 63. And the title of my little devotion tonight is Lessons in Spiritual Drought. Lessons in Spiritual Drought. A few weeks ago, I had a large chunk of land being hydroseeded with grass seed. And I know, before you tell me, it probably is the worst time to plant grass seed. It was really hot, and there was no water. In this psalm here, David mentions he's in a place with no water. And so anyways, I was scrambling to try and get water on this grass, and I was quite a long time at it. And I just got thinking, what does the word say about water? And, because you got 7 hours to water the lawn, you can do quite a bit of things with that 7 hours. However, you're kind of tied to the water hose as you kind of lift it up every now and again, so I couldn't do too much. So I thought to myself, where does it mention water in the Bible? In Psalm 63, I just thought, this is mentioning the word water, and it talks about spiritual drought, I believe. And my Thompson Chain Reference Bible entitles this psalm, Joy in the Fellowship of God. Joy in the Fellowship of God. And I think one of the hardest things to do in spiritual drought is to enjoy the fellowship of God. And so there's lessons here that I took out of this chapter, out of this book here, that I'll share with you tonight. Just in reference to we'll just read the chapter here, I guess. In verse 1, it says, O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. Thus I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches, because you have been my help. Therefore, in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. My soul follows close behind you. Your right hand upholds me. But those who seek my life to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals, but the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him shall glory, but the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped. And so in this chapter here, I picked out a few verses that may represent no joy in the fellowship of God. It's just the opposite of verse 3. He finds that God's loving kindness is better than life. Well, maybe if there's no joy in our fellowship with God, there's no appreciation of his loving kindness. In verse 5, it speaks about praising him. When was the last time we just broke out in song individually, with ourselves and God, and not in a congregational setting, but just individually in verse 5. Verse 7 says that he had joy in reflecting on past fellowship experiences with God. And so as you remember the past times, those times of deliverance, those times of his presence that touched you in a very special way, when was the last time you had joy on reflecting on these? In verse 5, back up to 5, it says that you're satisfied with God, satisfied in his person, satisfied with who he is. Verse 4, it speaks about worship. Maybe if there's no worship, we have no joy in the fellowship of God, a bowing down to his purpose, his will, his way. In verse 4, just took those things as what David discovered afresh in the wilderness here. He's the king, but he finds himself on the run. He finds himself in the wilderness where there indeed is physically no water. And yet he speaks about this, I think, as a spiritual experience as well, where there could be drought in his life. God's first preoccupation is with our soul. Physically, he cares about that too, of course, he does. But the outward man perishes, and the inward man is renewed day by day. And we have to sense this renewal in these times of drought. And so God is very, very concerned and very interested in our souls throughout this chapter here. We're going to get to the lessons in a minute. I only have 15 minutes, so don't worry, I won't go over. He's very interested in our souls. Verse 1, it says, my soul thirsts for you. He creates a thirst in us. If we're a believer here tonight, the New Testament says that he has created a new man in us, and that new man thirsts for God. And so he creates an appetite for himself in our souls, and that's special. In verse 5, it says that my soul shall be satisfied. And so in this drought, where there's really nothing around for David to really feast in, he experiences extreme satisfaction of fullness in his God as he remembers the power and the glory of God, not seeing it in front of him. He's a king on the run. He's a king fleeing for his life. He's not seeing this, but in a spiritual way, he's touched with the power and glory of God. And then in verse 8, it says, my soul follows close behind you. Your right hand upholds me. This speaks to me of attraction. My soul still follows close behind you. I think in times of drought, we may not be attracted so much as to who the Lord is to us in our lives. We may have temptations to leave following the Lord, but here David is impressed so much. He's not distracted by the drought conditions around him. He finds his attraction still in the God who cares and loves for him and is able to satisfy his soul. And that's really the victory here, is the satisfaction of his soul. And so some of the lessons here I have for us, lessons in spiritual drought. It says in verse 1, he says, "O God, you are my God. Early will I seek for you. Early will I seek for you." I think that in times of spiritual drought, that's the last thing we want to do. It seems for me anyways. I mean, I just sense that, what, really? The word of God is going to be like water to my soul and water me. I just want to kind of, I don't believe in that somehow. I don't, the faith is weak at that point. It's really at these times of drought and starvation that I really don't want to go early to something that'll feed me. Maybe there's, I don't know, it's a real challenge to my faith. You know, and that sense that God will speak to us through his word. Sometimes I want to delay that, but he says here early. That's the word shakar, which means diligence and eagerness and earnestness. It implies impatience. So you become impatient with that condition of spiritual drought in your life. And you don't wait, you go. It's a persistent desire to the point of annoyance or intrusion. As soon as that spiritual drought, they say that physically, as soon as you start to feel thirsty, well, you're already down a few milliliters of water. It's too late by then, by the time you feel thirsty. So spiritually as well, it's almost like as if we sense that spiritual drought happening, we go early to God, early again, to the point of intrusion, to the point of annoyance almost. That's what it means here, early. It's the breaking of the dawn as well, early in the day. It doesn't have to be early in the day, but I just try to get across this idea that we don't delay. We go early to God to satisfy our soul. We know that when drought happens in our lawns, et cetera, it gives good chance for weeds to grow. And so we want to keep that ground watered. The second lesson that I learned here is that David was very used to being in the sanctuary, and he learned great lessons from God in the sanctuary. But here he is in the wilderness. So what does he do? He looks in the sanctuary. He says in verse 2, "So I have looked for you in the sanctuary." He was in the wilderness. So what does he do? He brings the sanctuary to the wilderness. And we can, I mean, the sanctuary is anywhere where we entreat God. It can be in the middle of a bush. It can be in the middle of the hike. It can be at the most difficult time that you're experiencing in your life. But we set up a sanctuary for God. He brought the sanctuary to where he was presently in that drought. And he looked for God in the drought. And so he found, what did he find? He found in verse 3 that his loving kindness in that drought was better than life itself. And life, I think sometimes We know this from many experiences that the joys of life are fast, they're fleeting, they're temporary, and even those joys won't totally fulfill your soul and satisfy you. We've read of people who come to the peak of their careers in sports and athletics and only to find that it's a big letdown. And you hear about that, but this is what he experiences, is this loving kindness from God is better than life itself. And so even though it's drought life, he finds loving kindness in God. And then verse 4, he finds commitment to worship. Isn't it the hardest thing to worship in time of drought? But I think it's really important that we learn to be satisfied in the periods of drought. Learn to worship in the periods of drought. In verse 4, while I live. It is here in the wilderness that we are satisfied. And then in verse 6, trust him for you've recognized the past experiences you've had with God. He's only going to do that again and again. He's going to deliver you again and again. He's going to meet you where you are again and again. And in verse 6, we're to trust him with our future. And he promises to protect us as we go forward. The last thing I'd like to leave with you is in verse 10. It says that they shall fall by the sword. So these are the enemies that David was fleeing. The enemies of his soul put him in the wilderness. And I think sometimes that we read the instance there where the Lord Jesus told Peter that, he was privy to a conversation that happened regarding Peter's soul. And he says, you know what, Peter, Satan has desired to have you, to sift you as wheat. And we may not know the enemies behind us to drive us into these droughts. Spiritually, there's a battle that goes on, and sometimes maybe it's our own choice that we put ourselves in those situations where there is drought. But David here, he knows where the enemy's future condition lies. They're going to fall by the sword in verse 10, so he doesn't let the enemies discourage him. The enemies have been behind the scenes driving him into the wilderness, but he doesn't cling on to that. He commits those bad experiences, those enemy attacks to the Lord, those difficulties that are around him, and he commits it to the Lord. And in verse 11, he says, but the king shall rejoice in God. And he experiences joy in the fellowship with God. And, he knew what led to this wilderness experience here, the drought that he was going through. Sometimes we don't know. We certainly sense it, don't we? But the admonition is that the lessons that we can learn is that early we'll go to him. Early we will seek him. And don't wait for the drought to further persist. And then to bring the sanctuary, the very presence of God into the drought with you. And then thirdly, just commit all these, the enemies or the circumstance that led to you being in the drought. Maybe you don't know, but you're going to commit it to the Lord, and you're just going to give it to him when you can't figure it out. And you're going to just trust him and look for him, and he will satisfy you. He will give you joy in his fellowship in the midst of this drought. So he's created us to thirst after him. He will satisfy us. And he will continue to create the conditions by which our soul will follow close behind him as we continue on in fellowship with him. So I just leave these with you, lessons in spiritual drought.